Okay. Uh, so thank you everyone for inviting me to come speak. My name is Carl, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area of California in the United States in a city called Oakland. It's very close to San Francisco, and I'm a part of a group called Speak Out Now. We're a sister organization of the RSO, as was said. We have small groups in the Bay Area where I am, and then we're also in the process of trying to build groups in other cities. For example, we are in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're starting to build a group out there. We also have people in Baltimore, Maryland, which is on the East Coast of the United States. And then we also have some people in the sort of region around New York City. So that's a little bit about our group. Um, we have a similar sort of methodology to the RSO. So um, one of our main works is doing work towards major workplaces in the areas where we're active. So we have workplace newsletters in different sectors, such as the train sector, the healthcare sector, and then we also participate in a range of different protests and movements that develop in the different regions that we're in, for example, around Palestine or around the climate or police brutality and things of that nature. So that's just a little bit about our group. Um, and now I'll go ahead and give the talk. So we actually hosted a very similar meeting to the one that you're hosting today. We hosted one on Sunday, uh, this past Sunday, to talk about the aftermath of the elections with workers and young people that we are linked to. And so a lot of what I'm going to say in this presentation is similar to what we said in our meeting here in the United States on Sunday. So I'll go ahead and get started. Um, yeah, this is just an attempt to sort of paint a picture of what is our sort of interpretation of the election results. What do we think we can expect? And from there, feel free in the discussion to ask deeper questions and we can have a nice discussion. So I'll get started. Okay, so the presidential elections are finally over. Just to start off to really show whose interests are really represented in these elections, this was the most expensive election in the history of the United States in terms of the amount of money that was donated to different candidates. The estimates are that $16 billion in total were spent supporting Donald Trump and Kamala Harris in their campaign. So $16 billion just to compete for getting voted. Um, Next up, what we want to do is sort of share our interpretation of what we think the vote means. And to do that, it's important to, I think, look at the actual figures and the number of votes that sort of each candidate got. So for us, yes, we can say this election was a vote for Trump. There's no getting around that. But I think if we dive deeper, we can see that this was even more a vote against the Democrats and their current rule, and really an election that shows a recognition in the population that both parties, the Democrats and Republicans, don't represent their interests. So why do we think that? Um, the first thing is to look at if we look at the number of votes that Trump got this time compared to last time. He did get 2 million more votes, about a 3% increase. So there was a little bit of an increase. Um, on the Democratic side, we saw that Kamala Harris got 7 million fewer votes than Biden did in 2020, which is an 8% decrease. So what we're really seeing is a bigger decrease in those that supported the Democrats last time, and only a smaller increase on the Republicans. Um, Another really important thing to understand is that we saw in this election that about 35% of all people who are eligible to vote, which translates to about 81 million people, chose not to vote at all for either candidate. And if you take the total number of people that didn't vote, that number of people is significantly more than the number of people that voted for either Harris or Trump. So if not voting was a candidate, we that not voting candidate would have won the election, and that's important to understand. So we see a relatively stable support for Trump compared to last time, massive drop in the Democrats, and the most number of people not voting. Um, and this is an acknowledgement, to us that these parties don't represent the interests of the electorate and, won't address the variety of problems facing so many people. Um, so with this said, we are seeing that with the second election of Trump, many people have been hit with a feeling of shock and outrage and sadness, nervous for what's to come. From his racism towards immigrants and Palestinians, his threats of mass deportations, his constant dehumanizing of LGBTQ people, his promises of repression against his opponents. Trump is eager to bring his brand of chaos and division in order to further divide the population and to really aggressively serve the interests of US capitalism around the world. Trump's elections, like I said, is making people really feel like they've got kicked in the stomach and that, there are very dark times ahead. But that shouldn't really override the reality of how deeply unpopular the Democrats are and how we can sort of understand Trump getting elected as a response to how bad the Democrats are. Um, many wish to dismiss anyone who voted for Trump as, oh, they're a racist, they're a supporter for everything that Trump stands for, but this really isn't true. And there's no way to sort of classify all the Trump voters as the same thing. Um, we think it's interesting that if we look at some states where Trump was elected, um, these are also states that at the local level passed several ballot measures that would be viewed as more left or more progressive or more pro-worker. For example, in several states where Trump was elected, there were local ballot measures passed that further strengthened abortion rights. And this is oftentimes taking place in states that the Republicans control. Um, in other states that the Republicans control, that Trump won, voters also at the same time approved laws that would raise the minimum wage for workers and other policies such as improving access for workers to get paid sick leave when they're too sick to work. So what you're seeing is Trump may get elected as the president in a state, but then you're seeing that policies that benefit the working class also getting passed at the same time. To us, it's really clear that one of the primary drivers of Trump getting elected was the state of the economy. Um, according to the exit polls, the Democrats lost the most votes among workers who said the economy was the number one issue for them. And among 22% of voters who had said inflation had caused them severe hardship, they voted for Trump by over 50 percentage points. So what that's telling us is that inflation was a major issue. The Democrats were seen as responsible, and the Republicans were seen as offering a solution. This shouldn't be surprising. The Democrats had nothing to really say to working people whose lives and living standards have declined in the last 4 years. Despite all of Trump's sort of antics, he would at least talk about some of the economic difficulties that people were facing and acknowledge that life was difficult. He would, of course, try to redirect all this dissatisfaction into blaming people like undocumented immigrants. But for many people who are struggling in this society, the recognition of their suffering could make a figure like Trump appear as an alternative in their eyes. And it's important to note that the Democrats' campaign messaging was that, the economy was fine and that everything was fine. They were saying, the economy is actually doing well. Trump is going to represent a threat to democracy. There's nothing really wrong. You should continue to support us. But if you look at the conditions facing workers, for example, s- uh, since 2019, so the year before Biden took office, housing costs in the United States have increased 54%. Energy costs have increased about 61%. Food prices on average are up about 25%, and health insurance costs are 22%. So, you know, what that tells us is the Democrats are saying everything's fine, but people are looking at the cost of living and inflation and seeing things go up dramatically in the entire time Biden was in office. I think another thing that we saw is that in areas, for example, where I live is a very traditionally Democrat area. Democrats tend to control the big cities in the United States. And what we saw is that Democrats in the cities had a very sort of record underperformance. And, for us, that has to do with the state of a lot of cities in the United States, particularly as we've come out of the COVID pandemic. We see a lot of cities that are really devastated with lots of crime, lots of homelessness. Um, we're seeing, in cities like San Francisco, there's hundreds of people on the street overdosing on drugs. So there's a real problem with drugs and things of that nature. So, um, for a lot of people, they've been living in cities where they see the Democrats are in power and they see that, these cities have been eviscerated by all these problems. And so even in traditional Democratic areas, you had some people, including, Black people who traditionally are seen as like a strong base of support for the Democrats. You saw the Black population, in small numbers, not huge numbers, the Latino population, another Democratic sort of uh, traditional base actually voting for Trump in an effort to, you know, hope for change. Um, and so, you know, I think the other thing that is really important to understand, and I think what people are responding to is that the Democrats have been in office 12 of the last 16 years. People remember how the Democrats were in charge during the 2008 financial crisis when the Democrats gave trillions of dollars to bail out banks as working class families were losing their jobs and homes. Um, I think the other thing, the Democrats and Biden promised to be the most pro-worker president in history, made a big deal out of getting a lot of support from the big unions. Um, but we saw that they basically delivered nothing on this front. And, for example, several years ago, there was the potential for a huge strike in the rail sector in the United States, which would have had a real impact on the economy and really would have shut down so much of the domestic freight shipping in the United States. And what the Democrats in the Biden administration did is they used their power to actually intervene in that strike and shut it down before no strike happened. The government was able to intervene and make them go back to work before it was able to happen and imposed a bad contract on those rail workers. Biden promised to be one of the best candidates in history for the environment, but in the past several years, we've seen fossil fuel production only increase. And under Biden, the US is now producing more crude oil per day than any country in human history. So more than Saudi Arabia, things of that nature. And this is, the climate friendly candidate. Um, and then of course we saw in certain areas of the country that the votes of young people and Arab Americans in particular did not come out in the same numbers for the Democrats. And this is 100% connected to the Democrats' role in financially supporting and politically supporting Israel's ongoing genocide and their ongoing slaughter in the Middle East. So, you know, for those that cared about the question of Palestine or the Middle East, there was really no option for who you were going to vote for. Both candidates were openly competing, and trying to be more to the right of each other in terms of how much they loved and wanted to support Israel. Um, so yeah, I think moving a little bit away from focusing on the Democrats, we have to be very clear and serious about what a Trump administration could represent. Um, Trump really represents this system with its mask totally ripped off. He wears his hatred of immigrants, and Palestinians like a badge of honor. He flaunts his hatred of LGBTQ people. He attacks women constantly. Um, so we can really expect a broad series of attacks on many marginalized sections of the population. Um, I think it's also important to note that this is a lot different than 2016, and what I mean by that is that uh, I think Trump was even a little surprised that he won in 2016, and there was a lot less sort of conscious planning in terms of going into the administration. Whereas this time, it's very clear that the elements of the far right wing and Trump have worked together with a lot more clear plan in terms of what they're trying to do. And we really see this through the people that Trump has already appointed into key positions within the government. Um, you know, Last time, as I was saying, when he was elected, a lot of the people that he appointed in important positions were more sort of traditionally linked to the state apparatus and had a career and an experience working in Washington, D.C. And those sort of elements uh, were able to challenge and sort of, I think, rein aspects of what Trump was trying to do in. But this time, it's very clear he's appointing lots of people that have little to no experience in the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. They're not as linked to the traditional state apparatus. And all of them are very much Trump loyalists that agree with him completely and will essentially do what he says. They're not as independent. Um, this can be really, I think, epitomized in looking at who is going to be appointed for the Secretary of Defense. So one of the highest military positions in the whole government is a guy named Pete Hegseth. And right now he is currently a TV host on Fox News, the right-wing news channel in the United States. He did serve in the military, but he has no experience whatsoever serving in the sort of military apparatus. And then this guy is suddenly going to be the highest official sort of in charge of the military. So I think that's a really good example of the type of people that Trump are appointing. Um, a little bit in terms of foreign policy, I think what we're seeing is that most of the people that Trump are appointing are very far right, sort of up and coming politicians in the United States that are very much anti-China. So the main thread running through all the foreign policy picks are people that have extremely hostile, extremely, we say in English, hawkish positions towards China. So very much seeing China as the existential threat to US power and that they need to be challenged militarily, politically, economically in new and more intense ways. Um, and of course, you all are in Germany and Austria. And I think that Trump has shown in the past a certain skepticism towards traditional institutions like NATO, demanding that European allies increase their defense spending, reduce their reliance on US security guarantees. And I think we have seen a certain response within the ruling class in Europe to begin to sort of take those steps in the last couple of years, particularly with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think Trump's win will definitely continue this trend. Um, I think, he will continue to sort of, I think, act in a similar way towards Europe. Um, I don't think there's an intention to totally, break with the traditional alliances, but sort of reframe them. There's a willingness to reframe them. And I think this all has to be understood as not abandoning Europe, but really rethinking how many resources are we spending in Europe and how much attention are we spending that could be better and more effectively used towards China. So that's the real focus is turning the resources and focus on the threat that China poses. Um, and I think Trump's win will embolden, right-wing political forces in Europe further. Um, you know, particularly the elements that are, against migration, that are against, the traditional EU institutions. I think we'll continue to see that strengthening of the far right and, potential Trump alliances with those political forces. Um, so yeah, um, coming back to finish on the US situation, now that I've talked a little about foreign policy, um, what we also know is that there are elements of the far right in the United States that are, exist outside of the formal political system. So what I'm talking about is like far right fascist militia groups and things like that. What we saw when Trump was elected the first time is those groups began to appear more in the US. They felt like they had an ability to do that, and we should, um, expect to see that here in the United States and are going to have to figure out ways to confront these groups when they appear. Um, and basically what we're telling, the people around us, workers, people linked to us, is that really this growth of the far right or everything that Trump represents, it's not a phenomenon that can be stopped by voting for Democrats. We see that the Democrats are actually the ones feeding it. Um, these conditions are arising from a social and an economic system that's in crisis, that can only really be confronted by the organized power of working class people to fight, to struggle against the bosses, to struggle against the ruling class and improve our lives and defend our conditions. And we see that anytime there's social movements in the US that take on a progressive character, that the Democrats are always there to try to take the leadership of them and bring them back into the electoral system. So we're telling people, we can't fall for any of this. We have to sort of study history and study the recent period and see all the ways in which the Democrats weren't um, an opposition to Trump, but really helped feed the Trump and the far right phenomenon. Um, Fundamentally, to conclude, we see that people are really disillusioned by this system. That's what makes a candidate like Trump popular for some people. Um, you know, People are right to question elections, but it's easy to know what we're against, and we believe we have to know that what we're for, a different society and how to achieve it. So, we believe that this period ahead could be filled with potential struggles in the United States that have the possibility to go a lot further. and we're committed to trying to participate and intervene in those struggles, not only against what Trump is doing, but for an entirely new social system and to build organizations that could play a role in that process. So that's what we're trying to do out in the US. And hopefully that was a decent summary. And then if you folks have any questions about stuff, we have a good amount of time to discuss.